I just want to welcome you all to our Mothers Out Front Massachusetts Climate Action Call. My name is Diane Sokol. I'm a member of the Brookline chapter and part of the statewide Clean Heat, Clean Air team. For those of you who are not familiar with our Mothers Out Front Climate Action Calls, in the next 45 minutes, you will learn about a specific climate action issue and we will take focused action together. So today we will be learning about how hot summer days lead to peak electricity demand and the impacts of this peak demand on climate emissions, air pollution, and electricity costs. We will also hear how personal and community actions to shave this peak can help to reduce these impacts. Best of all, we will be hearing about success stories and some positive movement from our State House to focus on cleaning up these peaker plants across the Commonwealth. This month, we're pleased to welcome to our monthly call our allies from the Berkshire Environmental Action Team and from Green Energy Consumers Alliance. Both organizations are deeply involved with the issues around peak energy demand, including work with electric utility customers, with policymakers, and with generating plant owners and operators. We are so pleased to share our climate action call today with these important climate allies. So here's a quick preview of the agenda for our climate action call. After a brief overview of today's focus, we will divide into breakout rooms just for a few minutes so we can connect with each other on a summer climate topic. We will rejoin the main room to hear the background information about our topic today, and then we'll move on to our action. We have set aside about 15 minutes of this call to take action together. We'll come back together at the end for a few important announcements and next steps, and we will end this meeting promptly at 12:45. We do hope you'll stay until the end. Before we get going, I'll quickly go over a few Zoom norms. Please rename yourself in Zoom to include your name, your city or town, and if you like, an organization you're with. Be sure to mute yourself when we're together in the main room if you are not already muted. You can use the chat to share comments or questions during the call. Closed captioning is available, and you should be able to access that tool at the bottom of the screen. And finally, we are recording this climate action call. If you do not want to be seen in the recording, please use the Zoom controls to turn off your video. Today's focus relates to our increasingly warm summer weather. On the hottest afternoons when air conditioners across New England are running at full blast, demand for electricity spikes. This is when the so-called peaker plants are brought online to add more capacity to our electric grid. These peaker plants tend to be dirty, inefficient, and sometimes located near environmental justice neighborhoods. So generating electricity to meet this peak demand comes at a high cost for your pocketbook, for the environment, and for public health. We will explain the details a bit more, and most importantly, hear about Shave the Peak success stories, how our individual and community actions have reduced the need for firing up these peaker plants. Plus, we will hear about how our state government is now also focusing on this specific issue. But first, we're going to give you a few minutes to connect with each other. Since we'll be talking about summer heat and reducing our energy needs, we want you to share your practical tips for staying cool and using less electricity. Do you use fans in your home, sit outside in the shade, make use of a community cooling center? Deb, can you put that question in the chat? When we go into these breakout rooms, briefly introduce yourself and be sure that each person gets a chance to speak to answer this question. When you see the 15-second countdown, use that time to wrap up your conversations. You will automatically rejoin the main room. Have a great time connecting. We'll see you in about 5 minutes. We will keep going on. We're so pleased to be joined today by 3 experts who will be providing the background info for our action. All 3 have been working through different channels to reduce our need for firing up those dirty peaker plants. Our presentation will start with Larry Creasham, the Executive Director of Green Energy Consumers Alliance for 25 years. Green Energy Consumers Alliance has a mission of empowering consumers and communities to speed the transition to a zero carbon world. Larry will be providing the background info on peak energy demand and why it's an important focus as we move toward a clean energy future. Our second speaker will be Lisa Wolf, Sustainability Coordinator for the Wellesley Municipal Light Plant, and she's also the chair of the Marblehead Municipal Light Commission, where she and her husband built a fully electric net zero home. A lifelong learner, Lisa looks forward to sharing what she has learned from her own experience as a homeowner, educator, and engineer. Today, Lisa will demonstrate how coordinated town-wide efforts in Wellesley to shave the peak resulted in money saved for the light plant's customers. And our third guest speaker, Rosemary Wessel, is the co-founder and program manager for the Berkshire Environmental Action Team's No Fracked Gas in Mass program. She has been an influential advocate for transitioning our peaker power plants from fossil fuel use to renewables and energy storage. Rose will share with us her successes at reducing climate emissions and air pollution by working directly with peaker plant operators. So welcome to all three speakers, and Larry, we will begin with you.
Sounds good. Thank you. If you could, I've got a few slides. First, for those of you who don't know me, I'm the Executive Director of Green Energy Consumers Alliance. We're a nonprofit organization that's been around for 42 years. We're based in Massachusetts and Rhode Island with a mission to empower consumers like yourselves and communities that you live in to speed a just transition to a zero carbon world. Next slide. So when we're talking about shaving the peak, obviously we're all Massachusetts centric here, but just a reminder that Massachusetts is, along with the other 5 New England states, forms a power pool. It's overseen by the regional grid operator called ISO New England. And at all times, the supply of electricity has to meet the demand, and it can fluctuate by the hour and seasonally, can even fluctuate if there's clouds moving in or out overhead. So that's an important key piece to the puzzle. Next slide. So what we're here to talk about is, what do we mean by a peak day? Every day there is a peak for that particular day of where the energy demand, which is the number of megawatts that are needed to meet our needs at a particular moment, is highest. And it's almost always between 4 and 8 p.m. Throughout the summer. And so I want to show you here, this graph shows the green line is a nice normal April day where we don't have air conditioning or heating going on. And you can see that that load was 15,000 megawatts. And this is throughout all of New England. And but this past couple of weeks ago, we had July 16th, was really hot and humid. And you can see a dramatic increase in the demand at about 6:30 p.m. that day. That difference cost a lot of environmental harm because it's met mostly by fossil fuels, because we want as much wind and solar power and hydropower as we can get, but they're already maxed out. They're already producing. And so we need to make up the difference with fossil fuels, which are very polluting. But if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, the wholesale price of electricity is much, much higher, maybe by a factor of 10 sometimes, compared to the lowest point in the day. So we pay a lot for that dirty power. Next slide. So here's an example of what the fuel mix looked like on July 16th. And, it's a lot of fossil fuels. You can notice that somehow we were able to import some hydro at peak time, which isn't always possible, but it was that particular day. If it wasn't for that, we would have needed to procure more oil. But look, that's the purple section. May not look like a big section, but we want that to be zero, and that it grew quite a bit. So that's putting out oil pollution at a time when it's hot, air quality is worse. It makes for a very bad situation. Next slide. Now, this is just another similar graph showing the fuel sources also on another relatively mild day, September 5th of 2023, about a year ago. And you can see there's some oil in the mix, but it's much less than it was on July 16th. That's what we're after here. We're trying to meet the peak with clean resources or avoid the peak. Try to shave the peak is what we're getting at. Next slide. So here's what's called the duck curve. This is pulled off the ISO New England website. This is the last such date that they put it on, April 9th. If they did it for April 9th of 2024, it would show probably a fatter duck, meaning without the solar power that we have in New England, the demand would be much higher than what the grid saw. And this is behind the meter solar, basically the kind that you might have on your roof. And as you can see, but because of the solar, the belly gets deeper and it gets fatter, gets deeper, and brings that demand to the grid down. So solar is a great contributor to meeting the peak. And when we run the solar, we certainly need less fossil fuels. But as you can see on the right-hand side, it's steep. And so when we reach that peak period, we need to think about how we're going to meet that, because it's so, it's going to be hot and humid on some days in July. And how are we going to meet that demand? We don't want to go to fossil fuels if we can avoid it. Next one. So shaving the peak. We can anticipate when peak events will happen. I know we make fun of meteorologists all the time, but they are pretty accurate with a day or two ahead. And so we all know when it's hot and humid, and we know when it's coming. And so we ought to be thinking about what we can do to reduce our energy usage at that time. The biggest driver of the peak in the summer is, of course, air conditioning. So can we turn that down? Can we invest in efficient appliances that would reduce usage and demand all year round? So the refrigerator doesn't run more in July than it does in April so much. But if you had an efficient refrigerator, that's better than an inefficient refrigerator. So that's an example of passive demand reduction. Load shifting. Can you delay your laundry? Can you run the dishwasher after the peak? For those of us, increasingly numbers of people have EVs. Can you charge it overnight rather than during that peak period of, say, 4 to 8 p.m.? So technology enables all this. There's the Connected Solutions program that I think others will be talking about. You can easily time when you charge your EV, and you can even charge the time when you run your heat pump water heater if you want to do that. You can even time your usage of air conditioning. So let's use technology to its fullest. Next slide. So a few years ago, we started a program called Shave the Peak. It's a program where if you sign up for it, you go to our website, and we will, you authorize us to send you a text alert. And we'll do that usually the day before what we expect to be a very bad peak. We're not going to bother you every day in the summer. That tends not to work effectively. We'll try to give you a heads up when we expect to see a heat wave, for example. Usually the third day of a heat wave is really when demand will go up. People have kind of had it with the heat and humidity. And so we're going to try to give you a heads up on that, and just try to give you a little bit of a pep talk about how you can reduce your demand during that period. So we think that we've proven we've got 5,000 people have enrolled in the program. Nobody gets paid to do this. We wish we could, but we're trying to set an example for the utilities who could run a far more robust program than what we're capable of doing. And we'd like to see them be able to reward you as well. Next slide. That's a way to use the QR code to sign up. You can also go to our website with the URL, greenenergyconsumers.org, shave the peak. So this is an article in the Boston Globe that came out recently. We're thrilled to see that Governor Healy has appointed Melissa Lavinson to head up a new office of energy transformation. I think others will talk about this. And that's Melissa is going to work on trying to help with the transition from fossil fuels to clean electricity. And one particular task that she wants to take on is how to shut down and convert existing fossil fuel power plants such as the peaker plants that run on oil or gas and fire up on the coldest and hottest days. I'm thrilled that I was asked to be on her advisory board. So this is one of many tasks that she's going to take on. We're going to try to stop gas expansion. We're going to try to figure out how to wind down the gas system and delivered fuels as well. But I'm looking forward to that, and it's just very nice that others will be able to speak to this particular aspect of the Office of Energy Transformation. And I
Great,
think that's it.
thanks, Larry, and we'll pass it on to Lisa Wolf. And Lisa, I hope you're unmuted.
I'm unmuted. Hi, everybody.
You didn't leave anything to pull on.
Well, you're right. Let me
Oh.
work on it because you only have one hand all the time.
Somebody else needs unmuting or muting.
So thank you, Larry. That was a great overview, and I'm going to maybe reiterate a couple of the points that you just made. I'm the sustainability coordinator for Wellesley Municipal Light Plant, which puts me in a fairly unique position because I'm managing demand and communicating to customers from a municipal perspective as opposed to from an investor-owned utility. So that gives us a lot more flexibility in how we respond and how we communicate with our customers. Next slide, please. So this is underscoring what Larry just talked about in terms of the demand of electricity changes on a day-to-day basis, and the cost fluctuates with that as well. These are graphs from the ISO New England ISO To Go website, which is, I would say, fairly addictive, especially for nerdy people. There's a lot of information about demand and cost and fuel supply, which is also, I believe, where Larry drew his information from. But this is from last week. On the July 30th and 31st, this is showing what the demand was. The graph on the left is showing how demand went from 12,000 megawatts to close to 21,000 megawatts. So that's almost a doubling of demand between 4 a.m. and 7 p.m. And during that same time period, the cost of electricity went from 3 cents per kilowatt hour to 21 cents per kilowatt hour. So factor of 7 times. So this is underscoring the cost differential, which is one important reason why we need to be aware of when we're using our electricity. But if you go to the next slide, this is the same graph also showing the change in demand from the morning hours of 4 a.m. to the peak hours between 4 and 8 p.m., also from the ISO New England website. But this is for the system peak in 2022. So this was the one day of the year that the grid had the greatest demand in electricity. And the cost in this case went from 12 cents per kilowatt hour to over $1. So almost a tenfold increase in cost for that one period between 4 and 8 p.m. And this graph also shows the carbon emissions, and you can see the carbon emissions, the scales on the right-hand side of this graph, they're going from about 75 to almost 200 tons of carbon dioxide per hour. So that's over a doubling, almost a tripling of carbon dioxide emissions during that period of time. So every day that, can you go back to that one for just a sec? So every day that we are using a lot of electricity, especially during heat waves, then we are causing these more dirty, more inefficient power plants to come online, but they only need to come online for those short periods of time during the peak season. And most of the rest of the year, they're just idle, on call, basically waiting to come into play. But this 1 hour of the year when electricity demand is the highest has a really important impact on the cost that we pay for the entire year on our electricity bills. And I'll explain that in the next slide. So ISO New England has to be prepared for those high demand days. And what they do, again, is they put generators on call to be called up on a moment's notice to be able to supply electricity when the demand is high. And they pay generators. For example, I live in Marblehead. We have a diesel generator plant, which generates 5 megawatts of electricity. And we get paid about $4,000 per megawatt month. In other words, about $20,000 per month to be on call to provide electricity. That's not for the electricity we're actually generating. It's just to be on standby. And ISO New England then passes those costs along to all of the utilities in its region. And that accounts to what's called a capacity charge, which amounts to about $39,000 for every megawatt of demand during that one annual peak hour on the grid. And so that's throughout the whole year. $39,000, that amounts to several $100,000 for the whole year. So that if we can reduce our demand by even a megawatt, we're reducing the cost of our electricity by $39,000. And again, I just want to reiterate that that's 1 hour of the whole year. That's determining the cost that we're paying, which accounts to about 37% of our total energy charge throughout the year. So that one critical hour is really important to pay attention to. So what Wellesley does is we pay attention to Municipal Action Planning Committee, the MAPC alert, and you see a slice of that. So that's really intended for utilities, although it is helpful for customers too if you want to anticipate the week ahead. But it shows you whether ISO is anticipating a peak, whether it's likely, unlikely, or possible. So for example, this is the week this week, and we can see that a peak is not predicted for the whole week. When a peak is anticipated, then the MLP puts together a peak alert, and you can see an example of that on this slide. That is, we send this out in the morning, and we send it out to all of our customers, and we send it out also to all of our communication networks in town and try to spread the word as broadly as possible that a peak is coming. And on that day, we ask people to reduce electricity use by turning their AC thermostat up a few degrees, by not charging their cars, for not using any unnecessary appliances like pool filters, clothes dryers. And then it's important, I think, to underscore that we're not running out of electricity. There's not a shortage of electricity. It's just costing us a lot of money. So it's really beneficial to everyone in the community to reduce demand during that hour. So this is showing on that July peak in 2022, both the ISO New England's demand and Wellesley's demand. The blue line is the ISO load, and you can see that that peaked around 6 p.m. Thank you for anticipating that. So around 6 p.m., the ISO grid peaked. The orange line is showing what the demand would be if there were no behind the meter solar. So the total demand is higher, but you can also see that the peak is shifted because of the solar online, shifted and reduced. So solar is definitely helping take some of the bite out. If we could put all of our solar into storage and shift it, that would be even more beneficial. So on that date, on July 20th, 2022, the MLP sent out alerts to all of our customers. And we saw a demand reduction of 1.3 megawatts from our peak to the demand that was coinciding with the ISO's peak. So 1.3 megawatts of demand reduction, we believe, was due to our communicating to our customers. So again, looking at the ISO peak and comparing that to Wellesley's peak, you can see that the peak is shifted due to behind the meter solar. So what was historically a peak occurring from 2 to 4 p.m. is now shifted to 5 to 7 p.m. The town's peak reduction was about 1.3 megawatts. And that actually was assisted by Wellesley College in the town of Wellesley, which has its own peaker plant. So they reduced demand by about 850 kilowatts during that time period. But there was an additional 450 kilowatts, which we believe was due to voluntary demand due to the communications with our customers. And so that total demand of 1.3 megawatts resulted in a reduction of about $67,000 for the MLP in terms of our operating costs. So $67,000 is not a lot compared to our total operating revenue, but if you divide that by our 10,000 or so customers, that's about $7 per year. But that's just an example of the possibility. Another megawatt hour would have resulted in another $50,000 in reduction. So the more we can get customers to reduce demand during that one peak hour, it benefits everyone by reduced electric costs. So I just wanted to point out that that's actually a small amount. I said $6 or $7 per customer based on a megawatt or so of demand reduction. Looking ahead, I think time of use pricing and critical peak pricing is going to be a really important part of the equation. Critical peak pricing puts a very high price on that 1 hour. And if communicated to customers ahead of time, they're not just doing it voluntarily. They're not just reducing demand voluntarily, but they're going to see an actual benefit on their bills. If they don't reduce demand during that critical hour, then they'll see a much higher price for the electricity that's being consumed in that time. I think adding batteries both at the utility and the residential scale is also critical because, again, we can take all that solar that's being put online when the peak is not occurring and shifting it to when the peak is occurring and getting the most benefit and the most reduction of the dirty peaker plants that are coming online instead.
Okay, Lisa, thank you. All of this info will be in the slides and we need to move on to
Sure.
Rose next. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rose. I'm with Berkshire Environmental Action Team, No Frat Gas and Mass program. And for almost 5 years now, we've been working on the Put Peakers in the Past program. And as Larry mentioned, the peaker plants are almost always fossil fuel. They're also mostly very old, inefficient plants. The average age for these plants is 30 to 50 years old. So they tend to be really inefficient and highly polluting. And even though these run only a few hours a day and a few days of the year, they can take as long as 12 hours to ramp up. So when they get the call that, oh, there's going to be a peak and they turn on their plants and start warming them up, that's 12 hours of emissions, even if they never turn the plant on. And the one in Pittsfield, for instance, can run for the entire peak event. So if it's like 3 days of expected peak, it can run all that time with startup generators before they kick on the main generators, even if they never generate electricity. So these put out CO2 emissions, which are bad for climate. They also put out particulate matter, especially PM 2.5. They run them mostly on gas or fuel oil, but some of them are so old they still run on kerosene jet fuel. And those have some heavy health impacts. It can lead to reduced lung function, aggravation of asthma or COPD, more severe COVID outcomes. That's because the particulate matter is a very fine particle, fraction of a width of a human hair, and it gets into the nasal passages, into the lungs, and can even cross into the bloodstream. So it can start to affect the organs, and that's when it can cause cardiovascular disease, stroke, or heart attack. It's been shown to increase cases of diabetes, preterm birth, and premature death. And it's children, elderly, and chronically ill folks who are the most vulnerable. And as mentioned, most of these are placed in environmental justice neighborhoods. This map shows where the worst polluters are. There's actually more peakers than this, but we've identified the ones in red that we want to work on. There are 2 marked in green that are already transitioning, 1 that's being challenged, and 2 that have been retired. And these are two of the ones that have been retired, or three that have been retired. These are two in Berkshire County that have been retired. We put a community pressure campaign, signing a peaker petition and approaching the owners and saying, you should be decarbonizing. How are you going to do that? Do you have any plans? And nobody had any plans, but the owner of these plants said, we should be working on this. So as a result, two Berkshire peakers have already been not only shut down, but removed. And next slide. The big one that they own in West Springfield was one of the heaviest polluting ones in the state. And it has been shut down now for 2 years, and they're working on converting it over to battery storage and solar. That is a way to continue to meet the peak without the emissions. And we're hoping to see that happen across the state. So next up, we're going to continue working on Pittsfield Generating, which is a large gas or oil plant in Pittsfield. And also, we're just starting to gather up community organizing on MATEP. That's the Medical Area Total Energy Plant. There's an organizing meeting for this coming up Thursday, August 15th. It's via Zoom. And if you want to join, email Murray,
We're putting that link in the chat. So
Great, it's going to be in the chat. This is the one that's right next to Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, Beth Israel Deaconess, Brigham and Women's, Harvard Medical School. It's right in the Longwood medical area. So there are a lot of vulnerable populations really close by. And this is an important one. They have 10 generators in there. Some of them work as peak, some of them work as cogeneration, and there's some exciting cogeneration happening in Boston that we can supply them with a model. Thanks.
okay, thanks. And thank you to Larry, Lisa, and Rose for sharing all that info. We're running a little behind because there was so much great info, but your efforts and the success stories are so inspiring. So I wanted to share one more exciting piece of info that Larry mentioned related to these peaker plants, and then we'll be taking our action together. In March of this year, Governor Healy established a brand new Executive Office of Energy Transformation that's also called the OET, and their goal is to strategize the Commonwealth's path to achieving an equitable and fair transformation from fossil fuels to a clean energy future. So Massachusetts is the first in the nation to establish an office with such an important and forward-thinking charge. The new executive director, Melissa Levinson, who began her work in May, she was praised by her ability to bring together multiple stakeholders to work on this. And 2 months into the role, the office formed an Energy Transformation Advisory Board and announced 3 priority focus areas. And one of those 3 is decarbonizing the peak. So this is all very recent and exciting news. So now we will take our action together. We have 3 actions to take together today. We will put the link in the chat to get our action toolkit with all of the details. You can finish it up later if you need to. The first 2 actions are very simple. The first one, we ask you to sign up for the peak alerts from Green Energy Consumers Alliance. Larry had mentioned that. And we will also ask you to sign a statewide petition to transition our peaker plants to renewable energy systems. The more people who sign the petition, the greater the impact can be when people like Rose and others are having conversations with plant operators and policymakers. The third action is a little bit longer. We will each be sending an email to the Office of Energy Transformation. We provide a sample email that we ask you to personalize, and the action toolkit has all of the instructions. What's in red, you just need to put in your own information on that sample. So the toolkit also has a few bonus actions if you have time, and some additional resources if you want to learn more about reducing our peak energy demand and cleaning up the peaker plants. So Deb will put that in the toolkit. We usually meet back at 12:40, but let's just take a few minutes to start taking the actions to get the toolkit, and then we will finish up with a few important announcements. I think I'm just going to go over our few announcements, and you can continue working on your actions later. You'll also get a recording and the toolkit. You'll get all these resources to look at more later on. But just a reminder that when we work together with our allies, we really do build our movement a little bit stronger. And it's great to be working with Green Energy Consumers Alliance and with BEAT and with others today. So later today, or maybe tomorrow, you will receive a follow-up email. It will have the toolkit we shared today, a PDF of the slides and a recording of the call. We do encourage you to forward that email to your network. Others may be interested in this topic. Tell your friends what you learned new today and encourage them to take action as well. And Mothers Out Front hosts a welcome call the second Friday of every month at noon. So the next one is Friday the 13th in September. If you've ever asked yourself, what more could I be doing to stop climate change, then you should definitely join us on this call. We want to help you find unique ways to use your talents, your skills, your experiences to help build a stronger, more effective, and more inclusive movement for change. So that link will go in the chat as well. And I would also like to remind you of our state primary election on Tuesday, September 3rd. That's one day after Labor Day. You can see here the long list of statewide, county, and local positions on the ballot. Most cities and towns offer the opportunity to vote by mail or to vote early in person, in addition to voting at your polling place on September 3rd. And we'll put in the chat a link to the League of Women Voters website, which is called Vote 411. You type in your address and they can provide a preview of all the races and candidates that will be on your ballot. We all know that this past legislative session was so challenging at the end for getting the climate legislation that we need and that we fought so hard for. So opportunities for a better functioning state government can start with your votes in the primaries. So please take a good look at who's running and vote accordingly. Finally, we want this climate action call to be on your calendar every month. Our next climate action call will be Tuesday, September 10th. That's the week after the state primaries. Put this date on your calendar and then watch your email for an announcement and a registration link. And thank you again to all of our expert guest speakers. That was so helpful hearing from you. And many thanks to all of you for joining together today in this action. So let's strengthen and amplify our message by spreading today's action through your networks across the Commonwealth, even across New England. And we look forward to seeing you next month.